All right, so now we're going to go to the next segment, which is almost identical. In the last one, we talked about the days of creation. There were 8 days of creation, 5 effectively for the old law, 1 that existed at the time of pagan Rome, and the 7th that would arise later on for a short time, followed by an old Sabbath in this world, meaning the church will rest from her labors and there will be a period of peace for humanity because humanity will be restored after a chastisement and live the gospel in their hearts. And then comes the end of the world and the 8th great darkness, the great apostasy, which then gives way to the second coming of Christ and the ultimate Sabbath, the resurrection of all men unto the new creation, the damned going into eternal fire and the good going in with their bodies, their new bodies into the resurrected creation. Just as Jesus rose from the dead on the 8th day. And the 8th day, as the church teaches, is also the first day. And we talked about that was an octave. As it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the days of the Son of Man. Similarly, St. Peter describes the world at the beginning destroyed by water, the world at the end destroyed by fire. Each of these verses are testifying to the octave, so that Augustine doesn't have the full picture. The 7th phase is not eternity, only the 8th. And we talked about St. Methodius of Olympia spells this out. It's just that we need to have the proper interpretation. If we took the 7th day millennium literally, as in the apocalypse, then we would have a problem, because we cannot have Christ coming back literally into the old earth and reigning with literally resurrected people for a literal 1,000 years, and then the end comes. That's contrary to the teaching. When Christ returns, that is the definitive end of time. All persons are judged in the public judgment, and all persons are resurrected either to damnation or to bliss in heaven. That's it. There can't be a literal millennium of resurrected people. But that doesn't mean that we can't have a spiritual sense of a general age of peace, spiritual peace. Okay? There's nothing that negates that. And in fact, as we have seen, if the people of God in the new covenant, like the people of old, journey the way of the saint, then in fact there is an age of peace, namely the people of God's experience of a unitive way of light in their walk. That was kind of when the Jews returned from the exile. They rebuilt the temple and they had the courage to resist pagan pressure and were allowed to live their law. They were more faithful than before because they had experienced a separation and renewal, okay? More faithful and more beautiful than when they got delivered the first time, in which they were very cranky and reluctant to come into the kingdom. So now again, that explains. Oh, and by the way, once again, you have the octave. In music, the blatant nature of music that God has given us is that there are a total of 8 notes to form the octave, not 7. You don't have resolution to the general pure scale of either a joyful scale or a sorrowful scale, unless you reach the 8th note. Only the 8th note returns you to the first, but one trajectory ahead of it. Again, and you can prove this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. See, 7 is leaving you hanging. Hey, now your result. 1, 8. That completes the octave. And similarly, you can prove it for the descent. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Incomplete. A. 1. A. Say the descent of the fall is the same thing. Doesn't resolve until you get to the 8th note. Okay. Now we're going to work it out in the Beast Kings. In Apocalypse 17, an angel carries John away into mysterious wilderness and shows him the beast. And the beast has 7 horns. And St. John effectively says this in chapter 17, verses 9 to 11. He says, "The beast that you saw was and is not and will be again. And the 7 horns are 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he will dwell for a short space. And the beast that you saw that was and is not, even he is the," get this, "8th, and is of the 7, and goes into perdition." Okay, this is one of the most profound verses in Scripture. And it can be said so because I'm trying to remember the father here that testifies to this. There's an early church father that testifies that rather than just Roman emperors like the typical Catholic praetorcy here, which is a useless interpretation, by the way, he says that these 7 or 8 kings could be ages of darkness. Okay, and I have to dig up what that father was, but it can be found in the book, the Orthodox book called the Apocalypse. They quote this father. Now, that's more reasonable, ages of sin, because the beast would symbolize the apocalyptic process of God's plan across human history, the big picture. Because again, if you're just talking about Roman emperors, it's useless, because all of the Roman emperors of the 1st century and basically of the first 3 centuries have the same property or characteristic. They're supremely narcissistic, self-deifying individuals who want everyone to worship them with a pinch of incense or else be tortured and killed. That's their characteristic. We don't need to know how many died before St. John wrote, how many lived while he wrote the Apocalypse, and how many came afterwards. Whether in the 1st century or until the end of pagan Rome with Constantine. Doesn't even matter because they all have the same characteristics. This is something we're going to get to, but...
Okay, Scott. I can hear you clear out here.
Sorry for the interruption. What we are going to get to is that what matters for human history is the greater ages and their spiritual characteristics, not useless details of these ages. Okay, we're going to take a break. Okay, so we're returning to the Kings of the Beast after an interruption. Once again, Roman emperors are useless. They all have the same characteristics. What we want to look at is simply the ages of God's divine plan and their spiritual characteristics. That is what matters, not frivolous details. So things like Roman emperors, the literal Parthian army, the literal 5 months of the fall of Jerusalem, literally Jewish Christians who escape, Peter and Paul literally, these are not very meaningful because they're just details that in the end don't bring about an experience of the whole history of the church. Because we have to ask ourselves, why would the book of Revelation confine itself to largely frivolous details of the 1st century and leave almost all of the history beyond completely empty as just a vague millennium? For example, not foretelling the Trinitarian and incarnational heresies which culminate with Islam, not foretelling the Great Schism, not foretelling the Middle Ages, not foretelling the Great Protestant Rebellion, not foretelling the great supernatural fall of humanity that occurred with in the aftermath of Protestantism, rejecting supernatural religion and clinging only to reason. And finally, our own modern apostasy, where men don't even live according to reason, right? And beyond, possibly a chastisement, possibly a period of Catholic peace, as Our Lady promises. And then, unfortunately, a great apostasy. Why would it leave all that out? and just leave it as a vague millennium. These are things we're going to explore in the book. But so anyway, it therefore makes sense that when we look at this profound verse, 5 kings have fallen, one is yet to come, and the eighth, and the beast that was and is not, he is even the eighth, and is of the 7 and goes into perdition. Far from being about Roman emperors, this could be one of those profound passages in the book of Revelation, describing sin, the great phases of sin within the divine plan. Let's look at it. First, we need to have the general rule. How do we look at the days of creation? How do they work out? Because it's a little complicated. Well, what is the day of creation in Genesis? In the allegory of Genesis, it says, evening came and morning followed the first day. Evening came and morning followed the second day, etc., on into the 7th day. What is evening but darkness? And what is morning but light? And so, if we were to correlate these as spiritual phases, then it implies that each day of the divine plan starts with a spiritual darkness, a great spiritual darkness, and is then redeemed by a great phase of light, at least relative to the people of God at that time. So now we can work out the days of creation according to that phase and see that the beast kings are then these phases of darkness within the days of creation, and it will perfectly fit. So the first day of creation is Noah's day in wickedness, darkness, followed by the light of the flood. The second day of creation is the darkness of Babel, and the light is the calling of Abraham, the marriage to Abraham, the Hebrew people. The third day is darkness. The Egyptians enslaved the Jewish people. And the light is the exodus and the forming of the kingdom. The fourth day is the great unfaithfulness of the Jews to the Hebrew covenant, followed by the light, the captivity that restores them to repentance, and in which they are eventually restored to the Holy Land, rebuild the temple, and have a greater faith and holiness. And finally, the fifth day, the darkness is the Maccabean struggle, the persecution, the war. And then the fifth light is the first coming of Christ. So right there are your 5 ages of the Old Law. Now note, the fifth light is technically an Old Testament phase. It's a New Testament phase. It's not Old Testament because it's the first coming of Jesus. However, you can't make it perfect, okay? It's basically expressing that of the first great ages of human history, up until the coming of Messiah, the first 9 segments, meaning either darkness or light, are the Old Testament, and then the 10th segment, or the fifth light, is the first coming of Christ. 5 ages of the Old Law. Now we go to the 6th day. According to St. Aethodius of Olympus, the 6th day is the day of labor for the church, to labor against heretics and schismatics and those who are wicked, to spread the gospel and the truth. And so that is, the first day is dark. The first phase of the day 6 is darkness, pagan Rome's persecutions. Then the light is when the church begins to preach her teachings out to the world. And, the Trinitarian, to work out the Trinity and the Incarnation, to confirm Peter's solemn rule, the doctrinal development of the Middle Ages, the Great Council of Trent that answered the Protestants, her encyclicals that led her through the phases of the world's supernatural death, trying to answer the social and political problems, the philosophical problems of the day. Okay, and then the 7th day, the minor apostasy. We are in the seventh day now. The darkness. The world doesn't even live according to reason. They're diabolical. And the seventh light is the age of peace. The minor chastisement presumably is going to bring peace to the world by converting them back. They will see the consequences. Again, they can't be exiled anywhere because they already are everywhere. Their nations scattered around. They need to be exiled into the consequences of their sin. Hence, when they experience these consequences, the consequences of sins against life, abortion, euthanasia, the sins against sexuality, fornication, cohabitation, same sex, and the terrible transgender theory which threatens to undermine the very fabric of society, they will learn that they need God, that they need to live according to even to the natural principles of life. And dare we say that Trinitarian mystery of the Catholic Church, which has preserved the sacredness of human sexuality from the outset, when all the world, even all forms of Christianity, failed it. And since Sister Lucia, servant of God, said that the final war will be on sexuality in the family, I think it is all but certain that these terrible violations of life and sexuality will be the ultimate essence that restores the world of the Catholic Church, to bring about this era of peace, which is the light of the seventh day. And it is an old Sabbath, meaning it is a rest for the church from her labors in order that she may be vindicated. It's a rest for her labors within this time, on this side of the end of time, before the world ends. Finally, the world will get lazy, forget what happened. They will stop confirming their children. This will lead to the great apostasy. And in the great apostasy, those kids who are not confirmed will not be able to resist, will not be able to endure the persecution, and they will be damned. But those kids who do get confirmed in their hearts, more or less, almost all will have the courage to die as martyrs and go to heaven. And at some time then, God will interrupt this process and begin and bring the second coming, which is the resurrection of all men, and the world to come that will never end, so that the good of this world will be resurrected into the new creation, the ultimate Sabbath, the eighth day Sabbath, just as Jesus rose from the dead on the eighth day. So now, those are your 8 darknesses. Let's look at the beast you saw was and is not and will be again. This is very profound. What it seems to imply is if the beast is the great manifestation of the fallen nature, okay, then it would indicate that in some sense the fallen nature of humanity will reign at some point in the beginning of human history. Then it will cease to be the reigning force of the divine plan, and then at some point towards the end it will come back and be the reigning force again. Well, it makes sense to, when we talk about the octaves, when Jesus says, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the days of man. And again, St. Peter, the first world was destroyed by water. The second world will be destroyed by fire. Okay, here's the way you can look at it. The fall, what we're going to argue is that in Noah's day before the flood, the fall reigned. The fall was the supreme force in human history. It was unchecked by any real chastisement from God. There was really no redemptive phase until the flood. In a similar vein, at the end of the world, humanity will have fully digested the gospel in the age of peace. They will have seen the fruits of the gospel. Christians will have been reunited, and they will have seen science and faith reconciled, but they also will have seen what happens when you don't do God's will. The world almost ends. Once they've gone through all that and they still won't believe, it will be an incurable situation, and the fall will be, as it were, irredeemable. The fall will be back again. It will be again, okay? No longer able to be redeemed. But between these two great phases, the first and the eighth, God is in the process of redeeming the world. And so his redemption is taking over. The beast is not. Okay? That's how you can look at that. Now, there's another thing. It says the beast is of the seven. Well, the great lies of the fall, which we connected to the false prophet, are themselves the driving force of evil. And we can actually argue that when we look at all these phases of evil, they are all contained under the pillar of these two lies. Okay? You can do it for yourself. It's an exercise. Okay? Let's just look at Egypt. Egypt is violating the anti-baptismal principle. It's enslaving people. It's enslaving people, and even from reason, to enslave people against their will is wrong. It's evident from reason. They resisted God's commands to let the people go. So that's the anti-baptismal disposition. They were also materialistic. They were trying to glorify themselves with pyramids over and against God. The Jewish people in the intermediate apostasy were anti-baptismal. They weren't listening to the law. They didn't believe in the law, and they violated the commandments. In our modern day, in the seventh day, the world, in the seventh darkness, the world does not believe. They're either atheists, largely, or relativists, indifferent, or rejecting everything. And they live all they want to live. Remember, St. Paul VI foretold that if artificial birth control, unnatural birth control, became widely accepted in all of society and practiced, it would lead to the entire collapse of morals. And it has. Everybody does what they want. Mother Teresa said, if a woman can kill a child, then who is to stop anything from being legal? Anyway, so yeah, see, the principles exist. In this day and age, anti-baptism and the anti-marital disposition of materialism are here in full throttle. And the great apostasy will be the same thing. Nothing short. Just worldwide. Right now, it's not absolutely worldwide, because Muslim nations aren't into apostasy. I mean, they can sometimes persecute Christians, but they're not people who deny God's existence, who don't pray, who don't try to do what is good in many cases. So they're not totally bad people. So, again, the whole world is not an apostasy, but a lot of it is. Mainly the European civilizations that used to be Christian. At any rate, this is what could mean and is of the seven. The principles of the fall dwell in all phases of sin. Okay. These are profound ways to deal with this passage, rather than seeing, Nero coming back from the dead in a rumor. It's goofy, really. It's very goofy. At any rate, this is what we wanted to see here in the beast. In the next segment, we want to look at something that solidifies our argument against Augustinianism, that there really will be an age of peace, a dark night of the soul and an age of peace, in the joyful mysteries. When we look at the joyful mysteries, there will be no way to get around it. There will be a seventh day within human history before eternity. That's right. And we're going to do that now. And it's going to be incredible. I wrote this article in the Homiletic Review, was blessed to have it shared there. It's mind-blowing. And God does these things. He reveals the deepest secrets in the most humble ways. Who could have imagined that he veiled within the beautiful, simple sharing and rejoicing of Mary and Elizabeth in the birth of some of the most important people in God's plan, that it was itself a microcosmic revelation of everything that would happen in the big picture. It's astounding. Let's move on to that. God bless you.